A suitcase containing a chilling journal entry, a barnacle-covered head of a porcelain doll, and the decaying grand staircase rail, a haunting reminder of lives lost. These are more disturbing objects recovered from the Titanic wreck. One of the eeriest items ever recovered from the Titanic wreck is the barnacle-crusted head of a porcelain doll. This doll belonged to Eva Hart, a young girl who survived the sinking but had to leave her doll behind in the rush to the lifeboats. Eva lived into the 90s and would often speak about the doll when telling her story, but what no one expected was that 65 years after the disaster, the doll's head would actually be found. It turned up in the 70s, 2,000 meters underwater, halfway between Southampton and New York, during a salvage operation led by Captain Abel Federico Nogueras. The head, which was cracked, bald, and covered in sea growth, was later confirmed to match a 1906 mold used by the original German manufacturer. Its body was never recovered, but today the head looks pretty grotesque. As you can see, lifeless eyes, the faded paint, the stains, there are barnacles all over it, which isn't pretty. Eva herself never saw it again before her death in 1996, but she was glad to know it had been found. Honestly, if she did see the doll head, she'd probably cry. Recovered in the early 2000s, this leather suitcase spent nearly a century at the bottom of the North Atlantic. Remarkably, the outer shell held together, keeping the contents inside mostly intact. Gloves, a pair of spectacles, a comb, and a small journal were found inside. Obviously, the journal drew immediate attention. Most of the ink had faded, but infrared imaging revealed some scattered entries, and one stood out. A short passage describing a dream about drowning in cold darkness. Not only is this creepy as is, but it was also dated just days before the Titanic actually sank. The identity of the writer was never confirmed, and the entry didn't mention any names. Now, could this have been a coincidence? Sure. I mean, I think, the possibility of drowning is probably on a lot of people's minds when they hop on a boat, but that doesn't make the journal entry any less somber or unsettling, and it stuck with the crew who recovered it. Not just because of any supernatural stuff, but because it just felt unfinished, like someone's thoughts have been paused and then just left there waiting. I mean, that is kind of exactly what happened. The Titanic's grand staircase is one of its most iconic images, elegant, ornate. At the time, it represented everything the Titanic claimed to be, new, extravagant, advanced, but it did not survive. It was most likely crushed as the ship split apart and sank, but during expeditions in the 80s, divers found what they believed were fragments of it in the forward debris field. One piece in particular, a section of handrail, was buried in sediment and warped. The wood had cracked along the grain, it was waterlogged and stripped of its finish. There was really nothing grand about it now, just this splintered piece of railing, but that's what got some of the divers. This was something hundreds of people had leaned on, walked past, maybe even desperately held on to during their final moments. So seeing it sitting down there in the dark where it fell, it hit harder than anyone expected. One diver later said it felt like finding a piece of a memory, not just wood. Inside a steward's footlocker was a clump of belongings, mostly ruined by pressure and seawater, but among them a few sheets of music survived. One in particular caught everyone's eye. Of course, there was a lot of damage, but there was a title at the top, "Nearer, My God, to Thee." It's the hymn reported to have been played as the ship was going down. Whether that's true or just part of the lore, finding the actual sheet music changed the way people talked about the story. The ink had bled in places, leading some to call it the page that cried. Others noticed faint fingerprints along the edge, possibly from whoever packed it. Divers found a bunch of tools in the wreck's engineering section, surrounded by crumpled steel and collapsed walls. Just tools at first glance: coal shovels, wrenches, heavy-duty tongs. A few had warped or melted, some were fused to nearby piping. One wrench still had a torn piece of glove jammed into its handle. These weren't dropped, they were in use. Everything about how they were found pointed to people working during the disaster, not running. Some tools were mid-task, left exactly where they'd been used, holding on, doing their jobs as long as they could. There's nothing flashy about any of this. It's just iron and grime. I mean, most of it's unrecognizable. It's the kind of gear that you'd walk past in a museum without really thinking much about it, but to the divers and crew who pulled them up, these tools were almost more important than jewelry or silver. They belonged to the people who had the worst job on the ship, trapped below deck, still trying to keep the ship from going down. A small Bible was found inside a cloth bundle tucked into a coat's inner pocket. Small, leather-bound, warped from water, but still mostly intact. The pages had swelled from the moisture, but one section was still readable. Psalm 69. A pencil underlined beneath one line, "Save me, O God, for the waters have come up to my neck." No one knows when it was marked. Could have been before the voyage, could have been during, could have been as the ship was going down. The pencil mark was faint, but it was definitely there. The cloth wrapping probably helped keep the Bible together. Most paper items that deep didn't stand a chance, of course. This one somehow did, and it wasn't ornate or expensive. The cover was plain, no inscription, just something someone brought with them because it mattered to them. This came out of a small handbag recovered from the debris field, a compact mirror, cracked straight through the center, the kind of thing you'd expect to find in any woman's purse in 1912. Basic, silver-colored case, no engraving. It wasn't valuable, but something about the mirror caught attention right away. Before it was even brought up, a diver noticed how the broken glass reflected strangely in the submersible lights. The cracks made these shapes that almost looked like eyes. At least that's how they felt at the time. Another diver joked that it blinked. Now obviously it didn't. It was just fractured glass reacting to the light, but after that, people started calling it the mirror that blinked. Not seriously, just as a nickname of course, but still, when it went on display later, some museum visitors said they felt weird standing near it. Something about it just made people uncomfortable. And that's the thing with objects like this. It's not just about what they're worth or what they were used for, it's about where they were found. A private item meant for quiet, everyday moments, but pulled out of one of the most infamous shipwrecks in history. In 2012, a small metal case was recovered from the wreck, wedged under some debris. Inside was a sealed glass vial filled with thick black liquid. Nobody could say for sure what it was. It wasn't labeled, and it didn't match anything on passenger inventories or supply logs. Some guessed it was ink, maybe used in printing or for ship records. Others weren't so sure. A few reports claimed the liquid behaved strangely when light hit it, forming these faint swirling patterns that looked almost like symbols or writing. Could have been coincidence, could have been some chemical reaction from decades underwater, but it was weird enough that people kept talking about it. The vial was never put on public display. Some say it was just quietly studied, then shelved, but the truth is that no one really knows. There wasn't much follow-up, and official records didn't get into detail. Still, it became one of those Titanic artifacts that people keep asking about, mostly because of those gaps. There's no confirmed use or clear origin, and no solid explanation for how it stayed sealed. Now, I'll admit, I have a hunch it's probably nothing big, but it's just odd enough that people aren't quite ready to let it go. This one's been debated ever since it surfaced. A scrap of paper supposedly found during a dive near the stern section. It was inside a waterproof pouch, the kind meant to keep documents dry in emergencies. The paper was torn, badly damaged, but a few words were still readable. Boilers gone, lights flicker, this may be it. Forgive me. That's all. There was no name or date. The ink had run in places, and the handwriting didn't match any known crew records. Some researchers actually thought that maybe it was a fake planted there, maybe. The note read like someone writing fast, though, under pressure, not expecting to finish the sentence. There's no hard proof either way. If it's authentic, it would be the only written message recovered from the night of the sinking. Written during it, not before. If it's not, it's still one of the more compelling rumors to come out of the wreck. And finally, we have a set of small hair combs found in a pouch recovered from the third class section. Just basic grooming tools wrapped in fabric and packed neatly. There's nothing rare or out of the ordinary about these combs, but finding them like that, clean, arranged, and preserved, it just hit a little differently. They weren't luxury items. They weren't meant to impress anyone. They were just part of someone's normal day. Probably an immigrant heading to America to start over. Most recovered artifacts fall into two categories on the Titanic. Big, expensive pieces or things too damaged to recognize. And these didn't fall into either. They were just normal. And that's what made it hard to forget. Not because of what they were, but because of what they said without meaning to. And that, as I've said many times before on these Titanic videos, these were real, everyday people. Some were quite wealthy, of course, but in essence, they were just people with hopes and dreams of a new life across the ocean. The Titanic and cursed Egyptian artifacts, two things you probably wouldn't think go together, but for decades there's been this eerie rumor about an ancient Egyptian artifact that was on board the Titanic when it sank. Sometimes called the Unlucky Mummy, it was actually a sarcophagus lid belonging to a priestess of Amun-Ra. Now, officially, the British Museum denies the artifact was ever on the ship, but some of these stories about this mummy actually came from Titanic survivors themselves. The story goes that the sarcophagus lid had caused problems even before the ship set sail. People who came in contact with it were said to have suffered accidents or even died unexpectedly. A wealthy collector, desperate to get rid of the thing, allegedly arranged to have it shipped to America on the Titanic. Even some early researchers and journalists claimed to have seen documentation putting the artifact on the ship's manifest, but that paperwork has mysteriously vanished over time. The wreckage has never turned up a confirmed piece of the lid, but considering how much of the debris field is still untouched, it's not out of the question completely. Wallace Hartley was the bandleader on the Titanic, the man who stood on the deck playing music as the ship went down. He and his fellow musicians tried to calm passengers in the chaos by playing music until the end. Hartley didn't survive, but days later his body was found floating in the Atlantic with his violin case still strapped to him. That violin became one of the most haunting relics connected to the disaster. For decades, people weren't even sure it still existed, but in 2006 it suddenly turned up in an attic in England. Tests showed the wood had saltwater damage, and an inscription on the tailpiece confirmed it was a gift from Hartley's fiancée. Scientists even used forensic analysis and CT scans to prove that it wasn't a fake. Today, the violin's been auctioned off for nearly $1 million, but should it have stayed lost? Some believe that items like this, so tied to tragedy, can carry an energy that may not be good to bring into your home. Adolf Saalfeld was a first-class passenger on the Titanic and a perfume maker. When the ship went down, so did his luggage, including a small black bag carrying dozens of tiny glass perfume vials. They were meant for business meetings in America, where he hoped to sell his latest fragrance blends. The bag was recovered decades later, buried in the mud 2.5 miles beneath the ocean. And you'd think those delicate bottles would have been destroyed, but not only were they intact, the scents were still there. And I just find that kinda eerie. It's easy to forget that the Titanic wasn't just a ship. It was carrying people from all walks of life, all with hopes and dreams. And artifacts like this bring all of that crashing back. Something about that lingering scent, still alive after all these years. It hits harder than some photos or wreckage can. Some conservators and researchers feel uneasy around it too, that there's something off about standing in a room and suddenly smelling something that came from one of the most infamous tragedies in modern history, and I gotta say, I'd have to agree with them. Among the debris pulled from the Titanic's wreck site was something small, almost easy to miss. A child's toy marble. Just a little glass sphere about the size of a thumbnail. When it was found in a leather pouch alongside other personal items, it stopped the recovery team cold. This thing had most likely belonged to a youngster. That just hits different. Scientists believe it may have belonged to a young boy traveling third class, one of the many immigrant families hoping for a new start in America. The marble was slightly worn from use. Maybe it was carried as a comfort object, and the fact that it went down with the ship, then sat undisturbed for nearly a century at the bottom of the Atlantic, man, that is somber. There's a weight that comes with holding something that personal. When recovery teams first found a pair of small shoes near the Titanic wreck, it was pretty creepy. These weren't just scraps of leather. They'd been worn by a child. They'd been sitting on the seafloor for nearly 100 years, and they were still recognizable. They're believed to belong to an unidentified person, possibly the youngest victim ever found, a boy who was pulled from the ocean by a recovery ship and buried in a grave simply marked unknown child. For decades, no one knew who he was, and these shoes became a symbol of every nameless person lost that night. Forensic science eventually identified the boy as Sidney Leslie Goodwin, a boy from England who died along with his entire family. The shoes helped make that connection, but even with a name now, the image of those tiny shoes sitting alone in the mud is something people don't shake off easily. One of the most chilling items recovered from the Titanic wreck was a pocket watch that had stopped at 2:20 a.m., the exact time the ship struck the iceberg. I don't think I need to do much explaining here. That is incredibly unsettling. A grim reminder of the exact moment when everything went into total chaos. Who owned the watch? What were they thinking about right before the hands of that little clock hit 2:20? We'll never know. Another one of the eeriest things pulled from the Titanic's wreck is a life jacket that clearly did not do its job. This particular one came from the body recovery missions, not the wreck itself. After the Titanic went down, ships like the Mackay Bennett were sent out to find the dead. One of the crew, Robert Edwards, picked up this life jacket from a body floating in the Atlantic. It's made of cork and canvas, old school and heavy. It's still intact to this day. All the ties are still there. The cork is discolored from salt water, but it hasn't broken down. What's unsettling though is that the jacket survived, but whoever was wearing it obviously didn't. Cork floats, but it doesn't save you from freezing water. It doesn't save you from hypothermia. This jacket was supposed to be someone's last hope, and all it ended up doing was keeping their body afloat long enough to be recovered, dead or alive. When researchers recovered a corroded safe from the Titanic's debris field, they were hoping for cash or jewelry, but once the safe was finally opened, what they found wasn't treasure. It was wet, half-melted paper and black sludge. Some of the documents were too far gone to recover, but there were whispers that among them were letters detailing business dealings, passenger information, and private notes that could have had historical importance, but what did survive wasn't the valuable stuff. It was receipts, random letters, odd banking forms, some completely blank. The unsettling part here isn't what was found, it's what wasn't. Something about the safe's contents didn't match the passenger manifest. It's entirely possible that something important was removed for or during the sinking, or that the safe was never what it seemed to begin with. Even now, some wonder, why was this particular safe stored where it was? Why so heavily protected when there was basically nothing inside it? Did someone know it was going down that night and try to bury a secret in 13,000 feet of water? The safe didn't answer any questions. If anything, it just made people ask more. When scientists first studied the Titanic wreck, they were shocked to find that the steel used to construct the ship was a lot more brittle than expected. The ship's hull, which was thought to be incredibly strong, had been compromised by a sulfur impurity in the steel. This made the metal especially fragile in the freezing cold waters of the North Atlantic. When the Titanic hit the iceberg, the impact caused the steel to shatter, tearing open the ship's sides. It wasn't just the iceberg that took down the Titanic, the actual material the ship was built from caused it to rapidly sink. We're all very familiar with this now, but it turned out the ship wasn't as indestructible as everyone thought. The Titanic's designers and engineers thought the ship was practically unsinkable, but this flaw in its construction, which was only apparent once the wreck was discovered, suddenly painted a very different picture. Now, out of all the personal things pulled from the Titanic wreck, one of the most powerful is a letter written by a first-class passenger named Oscar Halverson, an American businessman from Minnesota returning from a trip to Europe with his wife, Mary Alice. He took some time on board to write to his mother, talking about how beautiful the ship was and what life was like on board. The letter was found on his body, pulled from the ocean after the ship went down. The letter should have been destroyed. It was soaked in salt water for days, if not longer. But it survived, mostly intact, because it had been tucked away in an oilskin wallet. The cold water helped preserve the ink. So now, over 100 years later, you could still read his words. A man who didn't make it, but his message did. There's something about that that just hits hard. This was a personal note, casual, honest, and it makes everything that happened feel more real. That history isn't just a collection of stories from a long time ago, but that there were real people with real lives involved. People just like you and me. Charles Jellicoe, the Titanic's chief baker, spent hours in the freezing water before finally being rescued, and would go on to say it was mostly thanks to the whiskey in his system. Born in Birkenhead, England in 1878, Jonkin had a long maritime career before joining the crew of the Titanic. On the night of April 14th of 1912, after the ship struck the iceberg, he organized his baking staff to deliver bread to the lifeboats. He was assigned to Lifeboat 10, but he chose not to board, instead helping others before returning to his quarters, where he pounded back a significant amount of booze. As the ship sank into the Atlantic, he reportedly rowed the stern down, entering the freezing water without submerging his head, and then he spent about 2 hours in the icy sea, and later said that he probably survived thanks to the whiskey, which he figured insulated him against the cold. After the disaster, he continued his maritime career and later settled in Paterson, New Jersey, where he passed away in 1956. Michel Marcel Navratil, born in Nice, France in 1908, was one of the last living survivors of the Titanic tragedy, becoming known as the Titanic Orphan. In a custody dispute, his father, Michel Navratil Sr., abducted him and his younger brother Edmund, taking them aboard the Titanic under the alias Louis M. Hoffman. Claiming to be a widower, he was intending to start a new life in America. On the night of the sinking, their father placed the boys in Collapsible D, the last lifeboat successfully launched. He sank with the ship. The brothers, unable to communicate their identities, were simply dubbed the Titanic Orphans in the press. Their photographs circulated though, and eventually reached their mother, Marcel, who traveled to New York to reunite with them. Michel grew up to become a philosophy professor at the University of Montpellier. He passed away in 2001, remembered as one of the last male survivors of the Titanic. Molly Brown was born Margaret Tobin, but the unsinkable Molly Brown is how most people remember her. When she boarded the Titanic in 1912, she was already rich thanks to her husband striking gold in Colorado. But she didn't just spend money. She fought for workers' rights, women's rights, and education, and her drive to help others only continued when the Titanic began to sink. Molly didn't panic. She helped people get into their lifeboats and eventually ended up in Lifeboat 6 herself. Once in the water, she argued with the crew to turn back and look for more survivors. When they refused, well, she helped row the boat herself, even handing over her furs to others who were freezing. And she led a pretty interesting life after she was rescued, too. She helped raise money for survivors who had lost everything, and later ran for US Senate decades before women could even vote nationwide. Colonel Archibald Gracie IV was a wealthy historian from a long line of military men. When he boarded the Titanic, he was in first class, and he was kind of obsessed with the ship. He was writing a book about it even before it sank. But when the iceberg hit, Gracie went into action. He helped women and children get into lifeboats, stayed on board until the very end. When the ship broke in two, he jumped into the water and somehow made it to an overturned lifeboat. He clung to it all night in the freezing cold with dozens of other men trying not to die. Gracie survived, but it messed him up. He wrote one of the most detailed first-hand accounts of the sinking, finishing it just before he died less than a year later. His health had started failing, but people close to him said it was more than that. He couldn't stop reliving what happened. He had nightmares, he couldn't sleep, and when he passed away in December of 1912, some said he was still calling out for help. His last words? "We must get them all in the boats." He made it off the Titanic, but part of him never really did. Frederick Fleet was one of the Titanic's lookouts, the guy who actually spotted the iceberg and rang the warning bell. He shouted those famous words, "Iceberg right ahead." He did his job, but it was too late. There weren't enough lifeboats, and the ship was going too fast. The crash was going to happen no matter what. Fleet managed to survive by getting into Lifeboat 6, the same one Molly Brown was in. But surviving the disaster didn't mean his life got easier. He went back to working jobs on ships, but he was never really okay again. He dealt with depression, and later on, life kept piling on more problems. He lost his wife in 1964, and after that, things just continued to spiral. He ended up living with relatives and struggling to find work. In 1965, just a year after his wife died, Fleet took his own life. He was 77 years old. What's even sadder is that he was buried in an unmarked grave. For decades, no one really wanted to talk about him. not the man who warned the ship, not the guy whose voice was the first to sound the alarm. Eventually, a gravestone was added in his memory, but it took a long time for people to give him the respect that he deserved. Edith Eileen Brown was just 15 when she boarded the Titanic with her parents. They were traveling to America to start a new life. Her father had big dreams. He wanted to open a hotel in Cape Town and make a fresh start. But none of that happened. When the ship hit the iceberg, Edith and her mother were put in a lifeboat. Her father stayed behind. She remembered the last thing he said to her, "I'll see you later." But, of course, she never did. He went down with the ship, and Edith and her mom had to figure out how to survive in a new country with nothing. They ended up in New York for a while, but eventually made their way back to South Africa. Edith didn't stay quiet about what happened. As she got older, she gave interviews and told her story to keep the memory of the Titanic alive, especially the people who didn't make it. She went on to have a family and live a full life, but she never forgot that night. You could hear it in her voice when she talked about it, even in her 90s. She lived a long life though, passing away in 1997 at the age of 100. For a long time, she was one of the last living Titanic survivors. In fact, she died just 1 month after Titanic hit theaters. Eva Hart was just 7 years old when she boarded the Titanic with her parents. They were moving to Canada to start fresh, but her mother had a bad feeling about the trip from the start. She didn't trust the ship, called it too big, too fast, and too proud. She refused to sleep at night while they were on board, and that gut instinct may have saved their lives. When the iceberg hit, Eva's father put her and her mother into a lifeboat. He stayed behind. Like so many others, he didn't make it. Eva never saw him again. She said later that she remembered the screams in the dark and the horrible silence that followed. It stuck with her for the rest of her life, but Eva wasn't someone who let it break her. As she got older, she talked openly about the disaster and didn't hold back. She was especially critical of White Star Line and how unprepared the ship was. She hated how they tried to avoid responsibility and kind of downplayed the tragedy soon afterwards. Eva lived a long life and never stopped speaking out. She kept a photo of her father by her bed until the day she died. And even decades after the incident, she refused to forgive the people in charge. She said you can't call something an act of God when it was caused by human arrogance. She made sure her voice and her father's memory were never forgotten. Harold Bride was one of the Titanic's 2 wireless operators, the guys who sent and received messages for the ship. When the iceberg hit, he and his coworker Jack Phillips stayed at their post, sending out SOS calls while chaos just broke out around them. They were some of the last people left working while everyone else was trying to get off the ship. Water started flooding the room while they were still transmitting. Jack kept working until the power cut out. Harold tried to escape and was swept off the ship by a wave. He managed to find an overturned lifeboat, collapsible B, and climbed on. Dozens of men were clinging to it all night, trying to survive in freezing water. Harold was rescued, but he didn't walk away without scars. His feet were badly frostbitten, and he had to be carried from the Carpathia after being pulled from the ocean. He lost his friend Jack, and the trauma never really left him. After the disaster, Bride testified at the Titanic inquiries and eventually went back to working for the Marconi Company, but he didn't like talking about what happened. He kept a low profile for the rest of his life and avoided the spotlight, passing away in 1956. Lawrence Beasley was a second-class passenger on the Titanic. He was a science teacher from London. When the iceberg struck, Beasley quietly made his way to the boat deck and managed to get into lifeboat 13. But what really sets Beasley apart is what he did afterward. He wrote one of the very first survivor accounts of the disaster, a book called The Loss of the SS Titanic, which came out just 2 months later. And he approached the book like a scientist, calm, detailed, and brutally honest. He criticized the lack of lifeboats, the poor emergency response, and how preventable the whole thing was. His book helped shape how the public saw the disaster. And years later, Beasley also became known for a pretty strange stunt. He tried to sneak onto the set of the 1958 film A Night to Remember, the Titanic movie that came out years before the James Cameron film. So he snuck onto set while they were filming the scene where the ship sinks. His reason was he wanted to go down with the ship. The director stopped him, but it really showed how deeply the event stuck with him. He never fully let it go. Beasley died in 1967, but his account is still one of the most respected first-hand records of what really happened that night. And finally, we have Violet Jessup, a woman who narrowly avoided death 3 separate times, all on ships. Violet's story honestly sounds made up. Like some screenwriter was just like, hey, what if we had one lady survive 3 of the most major ship disasters of the early 1900s? She was on the RMS Olympic when it collided with a British warship in 1911, lived. She worked as a stewardess on the Titanic when it hit the iceberg in 1912. And amid all the chaos, someone told her to show the non-English speakers how to get in the lifeboats. She did it, got on lifeboat 16, and lived to tell the tale. Now you'd think that 2 near-death ship experiences would be enough for anyone, but not her. In 1916, she was a nurse on the Britannic, which was basically Titanic's twin sister ship. That one hit a mine in the Aegean Sea and started sinking. Violet threw on a lifeboat, jumped into the water, got smacked in the head by a lifeboat propeller, and still survived. Pretty amazing life.
Starting off our list today, we have the theory that the Titanic didn't actually sink, but instead its sister ship, the Olympic, did. You see, both the Titanic and the Olympic were owned by the same company, which was owned by JP Morgan. The theory goes that JP Morgan had wanted to sink one of the ships for the insurance money. Of course, being newer, the Titanic would rake in a lot more than the outdated Olympic, who had already been in a previous accident. But JP Morgan didn't want to sink his brand new boat he had just had other people spend so much time building. And so he did what any twisted businessman would do. He switched the 2 out. He sent the Olympic, which was unfit for the voyage, out to sea disguised as the Titanic. This claim has actually been backed by photographs of the wreck, in which the outline of the windows matches those of the Olympic, not the Titanic. Not only that, but just before the Titanic was scheduled to set sail, JP Morgan, along with many of his close friends and trusted colleagues, all of a sudden decided not to go. But if that doesn't do it for you, maybe this will. James Fenton, who allegedly worked on the Titanic, confessed to the switch on his deathbed. He said that he would have come clean sooner, but he feared for his life if he told the truth. I guess that didn't matter anymore.
There's also a theory that a steering mistake led to the disaster and that it was all covered up. Louise Patton, granddaughter of Second Officer Charles Lightroller, revealed a family secret in 2010. She said that a steering mistake may have played a role in the Titanic's sinking. Now, according to her, when the iceberg was spotted, First Officer William Murdoch instructed Quartermaster Robert Hitchens to turn the ship hard to starboard. Apparently, Hitchens panicked though and turned the wheel the wrong way, causing a delay before the mistake was corrected. This delay could have cost crucial minutes in avoiding the iceberg. Charles Lightroller supposedly learned about the error during a final meeting between officers before the ship sank, and his granddaughter, Louise Patton, stated that Lightroller kept this information to himself during the inquiry because he was told that revealing this big mistake would bankrupt the company and cost everyone their jobs.
Okay, so I talked about how JP Morgan all of a sudden decided to opt out of hopping onto the Titanic's maiden voyage. Well, you know who didn't opt out? JP Morgan's business rivals Jacob Astor, Isidor Straus, and Benjamin Guggenheim. That's a fun name. If you haven't already guessed where I'm going with this, I'm saying JP Morgan orchestrated the sinking of the Titanic in order to take out his business rivals. Or he sunk the Olympic to take out his business rivals and get a significant amount of insurance money on an old piece of junk all in one go. Apparently, prior to the Titanic leaving the docks of Southampton in England, JP Morgan had gotten into a dispute with the 3 men over a banking venture. Morgan had wanted to create a US Federal Reserve Bank. Jacob, Isidor, and Benjamin opposed. They died, and a year later, under JP Morgan's influence, the bank opened. Coincidence or cold-blooded killer?
Maybe the Titanic just wasn't as great a ship as it was made out to be. An unsinkable ship that sinks on its maiden voyage? It's pretty sad stuff. Sounds like there may have been some structural weaknesses involved. There were a few things that might have made it more vulnerable to sinking. One biggie was the way it was built. The Titanic was supposed to be super strong, but it had this design flaw where it wasn't divided up properly inside. Normally ships have watertight compartments to keep water from spreading if there is a leak, but the Titanic's compartments weren't sealed off all the way to the top, so when it hit the iceberg, water sloshed all over the top and flooded into areas that it shouldn't have. Another issue was the quality of the materials. Some folks say the steel used to build the Titanic wasn't as good as it could have been. It could break more easily, especially in super cold water like the North Atlantic. So when the iceberg hit, instead of bending or absorbing the impact, the steel just cracked, making the damage even worse. And then there's the whole deal with the rivets. The ones used on the Titanic might have been weaker than they should have been. When the ship hit the iceberg, it put a lot of stress on those rivets, and some of them might have popped out, making it easier for water to get in.
Another theory is that a coal fire in the furnace room caused the ship to accelerate to a speed which made collision with oncoming icebergs unavoidable. The theory goes that a pile of sorted coal begins slowly burning, with no smoke or flame, but burning nonetheless on the floor of the furnace room, and so to avoid a fire breaking out aboard the ship, the coals were placed into the furnace. What at first seems like a great idea soon turned into disaster. As the extra coals burned, they caused excess steam to form, which in turn caused the ship's speed to increase uncontrollably as the vessel raced forward directly into an iceberg-infested body of water. This is one of the most respected theories, actually, behind the reason for the Titanic's demise, other than poor navigation of course, as it has been supported by records that show that a fire had in fact broken out in the Titanic's forward bunker, which would have likely been caused by the excess of coals added to the furnace not long before the ship went down. Whether or not this was intentional, however,